Okay, had a few more people jump on. There should be some more people coming along shortly. But what we'll do is we'll just continue with the introductions and a few hellos. So first of all, I want to say thank you all for taking the time to attend today. I am making a little bit of an assumption here that you're either about to embark on an integration project or you have been part of one, or maybe stuck in the middle of one at the moment. I think integration these days is such a huge part of any IT software project, and unfortunately, they don't always go so smoothly. So, what I will be covering today is some of those less obvious items that make a success of an integration project. So my name's Narelle Carey. I am the practice manager for our innovation group at Fusion 5. And it's quite interesting, actually. The reason I came across the innovation group was because of one of our large integration projects. Seeing what they did with the tools and the processes made me actually want to join the group. So I hope that's a bit of an indication as to the experience in our innovation team as well around middleware. So first of all, let's just do a little quick review of the agenda. I'd like to do an intro first of just around myself and the experience, and then the components that make up an integration project, which I just spoke about before. Well, I'd also like to take a little bit of time to talk to you about what to look for when you're actually searching for a piece of middleware. There's so many middleware products out there now, and they do all check a lot of boxes as far as capability and functionality, but sometimes there can be a few little hidden gotchas there, it's particularly in the sales process. So I'm hoping to be able to give you some tips there about what to look for, and just before jumping and making that big decision in as to what middleware to select. Finally, I would like to finish it off with just what I would call my top 5 pieces of advice when it comes to middleware and integration projects. And I'd love to open it up to a Q&A just at the end. Now, I do have a little bit of housekeeping. I am presenting from Victoria, which means that I am working from home still. I do own quite a large dog, and we are expecting at any moment now the postie to come along. So she says hello to you, the big crazy dog. So I do apologize if there's any noise in the background. So just a quick introduction as to what I do at Fusion 5. I have had 22 years in IT. So back in the days where you had one email address for a single company, and yeah, 56K modems were pretty advanced. It's been incredible to watch not only IT, but things like integration move along so quickly. Back then, trying to integrate your products was just such a nightmare. But now we've got that many tools, and the software itself around your business applications now has so much capability to integrate that it's not such of a headache as it used to be. It used to have to always be point to point, such a nightmare. But what I also do is I go into organizations and I do some reviews and recommendations before they embark on their middleware project. It's a lot easier to spot those potholes before you start, as opposed to accidentally falling them down and then trying to get someone to pull you out of them. Not always a fun place to be. And with 22 years in IT, I've been in both situations. I've been in the middle of projects where there hasn't necessarily been a lot of engagement with different people, and some people aren't necessarily listening, and you do find yourself in a little bit of trouble. Whereas I've been in these projects where there's a complete understanding, open communication, no finger pointing, and it's amazing how much smoothly the projects themselves go. So what I always find interesting about integration and middleware projects is the requirements that tend to come out of it. I'm not kidding. That is the full requirements of something that we received. Seamless flow of all data. That's all they wanted. Simple, right? How hard can it be? That's also another phrase we hear a lot. How hard can it be? It's just getting data from point A to point B. And unfortunately, that's not the case. And if there is a lot of complexity, it can also it not just impacts the business as it is, but you then have to look at a lot of future planning too. So this isn't just about sending data from point A to point B. This is about looking at your organization and where you plan on it being in 5 years. How are the data structures going to change? How are the business applications going to change? Do we have any major changes in place for the business itself? So when we look at the different items aside from middleware, that make up an integration project, these are the key areas. So business processes, number one, must be strong. And I'm going to go through later a bit about the expectation versus the reality of what we tend to find in each of these areas. Please never underestimate the importance of vendor relationships and the management of those. It is very, very rare that you would have one vendor looking after all of your business applications that need to be integrated. So that needs to be planned and managed effectively. The build, test, and deploy schedule. It must be visible and it needs to be robust, and you can't just go adding lines into a schedule. It needs to be all the dependencies in there because that plays such a critical factor to your timelines and also how you build and test. That's even before you get to deploy. Understanding of dependencies. You'd be surprised at how many applications have certain dependencies in them when building this middleware. It could be that you're filling a gap or there's some data changes that need to occur in order for them to match into another system. But knowing those dependencies and having them listed and visible, again, is so important for everyone involved. And we're not just talking for you as the customer, but again, for all of the vendors so that they realize what they're working within. Understand a strong understanding of architecture and capabilities. One of the reasons I mentioned this, and this sort of comes into play with the vendor relationships too, is there'll be times that the business application can't actually do what you're asking it to do as part of the integration project. You may need to shift the responsibility of that function either onto another piece of software or have the middleware deal with it itself. So I talk a little bit about the structure of that later on too. A code versus data testing approach. I could actually talk all day just about this one topic, particularly when it comes to data. Code versus data testing approach. This is where your project lives or dies as far as getting it over the line. And when you're creating your actual project plan, have this in mind for every single point. What are we doing? Are we testing code? Are we testing data? Are we testing both? And how do we prove where the failure points are? I got a question mark on the last one there, extreme patience and a flamethrower, depending on the type of project and how it's going. Flamethrowers now are readily available through the Boring Company, but no, any middleware project does require a lot of patience because it requires a lot of listening. You need to not only be listening to the different vendors out there that are looking after your business applications, but you need to be listening to your people too. And I go into that later on with the business process aspect of it, because that can get you into trouble, especially around user acceptance testing, if you haven't been listening. So business processes. Whenever I walk into an organization, there's sort of a certain level of expectation is that I can ask, how strong are your business processes? Where are you at? And what I tend to see is what's on the left-hand side there. No, every process is documented and they're mature. And we've only got one that's ever used. We don't have any exceptions whatsoever, and everyone has the latest version. And I can tell you that pretty much never happens. So the reality, we always find that there are gaps or workarounds in those processes. And this is why it's so important to engage people on the ground. And even if it may not be that often that you need to engage in, but you do need to keep doing those checks in with those people on the ground to make sure that what you are building as far as an integration works for the current processes in play. And you always need to be listening for anything as far as change that's in the pipeline. I always ask up front for any kind of change management schedule that the organization may have, because that will give you visibility to the other aspects that are in play. But always talk to your people. Do we have new products coming on board? Do we need to change any processes for that new product? And when might that be starting? So do we include that as part of this integration project? I can tell you that there will be someone in the group that will identify every slight deviation that is allowed in a process. Where this can get problematic is when you're actually coding for things. If you find that you've got someone in the room that's going, oh, yes, but what if someone wants a green door over there and that's not standard, but they've got a blue house? You need to either shut this down, have a look at the cost for coding this and say, well, should we really be allowing this as a process in our organization? So while it can be frustrating that you have someone in the room that is identifying every single possible deviation out there, write down what those processes are and take that as an opportunity to go and speak to people on the floor, go and talk to management, and find out what is the ROI on this particular process. Does it happen 80% of our orders, or is it a once in a 5-year thing and we've only seen it 3 times? Please identify these processes, take the time to evaluate them. It will save you money and it will save you time as far as the projects go for integration and middleware. If you start doing it for every single permutation, the costs are going to blow out significantly. I have seen this in a project I've worked on personally, and this person would say, oh, well, someone 5 years ago did this particular order, and it cost the business $40,000 to implement that code. As much as we recommended against it, they wanted to keep it in there for the possibility of it happening again. I would not call that a sound business decision there. You would need to be looking at it and say, well, we need to change this. We don't allow that, or is there another way that we can do that? Please also just keep in mind that processes can become out of date during the project, depending on how long that project is. I've worked on an 18-month middleware project, integration project, and the amount of change that occurred during that time was incredible. And it was some things that were completely left out of field. It wasn't just process A had a slight little change. It's, oh, we've gone off and purchased a whole new business. It's not going to operate like the rest of our business does. So we're sitting there suddenly going, okay, we need to know more about this business. Do we try and fold it into this current project? Can we change their business processes so they do? Or do we need to look at this in isolation and then assess whether we roll them into the current processes? Apologies, it just cut out for a moment there. Vendor relationship and management. I mentioned that just before. Most people think that they can keep their vendors apart and that will benefit them. Oh, we don't really want A talking to B, it could cause a bit of a complexity or a political issue. Yeah, that's not going to work. We tend to hear people say, we're not going to need the vendors too much. It's a middleware project. All their applications are already running. They don't need to be involved. Absolutely, they do. And then they seem to think they can keep them isolated. This is to the detriment of the project. The closer that your vendors are, as far as understanding what needs to be done, the better your project will come together. Because when they can see something that as they're building out or coding, it could just be, oh, that doesn't quite make sense. It doesn't seem to fit in with here. And they can contact the vendor and they can have a genuine discussion about what is the best approach for dealing with this, because we thought it was going to be A, but we're finding that we really need to start to lean towards B, and then we can put forward a recommended change. But keeping them in isolation just does not work. And usually it's just, well, let's just tell them only what they need to know. The more information they have, the better. Excuse me. And again, having worked on a project where that was tried at the start and almost where they wanted the vendors to be, not on the friendliest of terms. It was almost creating reasons for them not to be friendly. It just did not work for the organization because we were doing everything in silos. And then suddenly there was no overall system coming together and no one pointing out oddities. Once we pointed this out to the customer and all of the issues that it was creating, the vendors came together. And from that point forward, we had joint everything. And even after the project's finished, we actually all still stay in touch. Be nice to have a beer with them at some point soon. So it just means that we're all going towards a common goal. We're all working off the same information. So it is imperative. Please remember that. Now, what you'll have to do is try and get them to also understand each other's applications. There is a reason for this, and this is again talking about gaps, dependencies, capabilities. The more we understand each other's applications, the more we understand its purpose and process. I don't know about anyone else out there in the audience, but I know that when it comes to business applications and you got a new person starting and you're telling them what each of the applications does, they always have capability overlaps. So by making sure that everyone understands the complete solution and what we're trying to build as an end-to-end process, we can then say, all right, well, we know for sure that the boundary of responsibility for application A ends at close of sale. And we know for application B, it's at the manufacturing process. So have that clearly identified. Now, the person that should be monitoring and managing all of this is your solution architect. Yes, there will be a project manager that would be overseeing the whole thing, but your solution architect is going to be bringing the solution together and will be working with those vendors to understand the structure of their systems. Because this isn't just about the value of A goes to the value of B. This is about, okay, well, we're sending that to there, but they have completely different values available. So what do we have to do to get them in a line? Should it be system A that changes or system B? Or is it that we need to seriously review these drop-down lists because they are so different that it doesn't actually make sense that we are trying to pass that data to there? And this does happen. I was involved in a project where we were looking at address books, going back and forth, address book details. And everyone thinks, yep, for sure, every part of an address book needs to go across. Company name, contact, phone number, email addresses, everything. And then when we sat down and we looked at what the people that are using each of those applications use the address book for, we ended up going, oh, okay. So once we create a company and its core details, we don't want to be switching any of this data between these systems, because what account sees as important information is not the same as your salespeople. Accounts want to know where they're sending the invoice to. They want to know who the accounts receivable and accounts payable people are. Salesperson doesn't care about that. They need to know what address they have to go and visit, not where the invoice goes. And they need to know who the major decision makers are in that organization. So it was an interesting exercise to see that once we broke it all down, everyone that was using these different systems really didn't need the updates of that address book information. But when it came to order detail and quotes and all of that real detail information, everyone needed to see the same thing. So I found that was an interesting time to knuckle it down and say, okay, well, we're realizing too that people aren't sharing and updating this information across the organization. So we did a little bit of a review of the customer structure while we were there. So again, we go back to business processes, and if there is something that should be reviewed, absolutely review it at the time of this project. So build, test, and deploy. It is probably the meatiest topic, but it's also the hardest one to try and succinctly put into a few bullet points. This build, test, and deploy, we can have maybe about a 2-hour meeting, an initial one, and we start to put a framework together. And the reason that this is so important is it needs to be shared. So if I take one of the projects that we were working on where we had 7 different applications that we were integrating as part of a single project, and that was from lead through to delivery of a manufactured product. What we also had as a challenge there was that there were other applications that were still being built as we were trying to write the integration. So we are trying to write integration into vaporware. It doesn't exist yet. That's really not a great time to be setting up your integration project. But they were saying, no, we've got to have it live by this date, so it must be done. It is really difficult when you've got this moving target at the end. It costs projects money and time. They think that they're moving forwards because it's going to save them time because they need to be live by this date, but it creates so much rework and therefore a lot more testing. And at the same time, there is business process changes that were happening around those applications that were being built. So, and I think you might actually be on this call that was involved in that project. But he said, we're trying to build the plane while we're flying it. And it's very, very difficult. So this is where we say the build, test, and deploy plan is just so important. Everyone thinks that they can build it at the same time to save time and money. And they seem to think also that, well, my application can do that, so that's fine, I'll just manage this. But they don't realize that that may be impacting another application too. And then there's also that visibility of that project plan. because one little thing goes wrong in one of those applications being built, and that just pushes the complete timeline out. You need to make sure that all those dependencies are adequately joined together so that they move as you go. Change freeze is something else I would love to talk to you about. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. There absolutely has to be change freeze during this process, but I am yet to work in an integration project where they have been able to successfully hold a change freeze for the entire time of the project. And then we need to look at things such as data. Most people, when we walk into it, seem to think that, yep, we can test with our real data straight away. No, absolutely not. You need to do a code test first before you can do anything with the real data, because you need to look at where your points of failures are. And the biggest thing I found is that when they think that users won't need to have any training around integration because it just all does it automatically now. No, it is absolutely imperative that users are aware of what is being created and potentially what it will mean for them. But this is also an excellent opportunity to review those processes with them, because then they could point out and say, oh, well, that's not really the process we use. I know it's what we're meant to use, but we get a little bit hamstrung and we take a few shortcuts here and there. So just as far as the reality of you build, test, and deploy, there are certain middleware products that limit how many people can be developing at the same time. It's especially if there's no source control, and unfortunately that is there in some middleware products. So this needs to come into play too when selecting your middleware. You need to have these things in mind. Without a doubt, all vendors must have visibility to the project plan, as I mentioned. And as I said, there should be a change freeze, but it is highly unlikely that it's actually going to happen. What we do is that we talk to you about how to manage that change, because there's no point saying, well, that's it, no change whatsoever, and it's at the detriment of your organization. And then when you go live with your integration, then you find that you need to start change already because we didn't take care of it during the build process. So don't think that change has to be none at all. We just need to make sure that we manage it effectively and we understand all of the change impacts. One of the projects that we worked on, every single tiny change had a change impact assessment done against it. It was distributed amongst the vendors for every vendor to sign off to say, yep, that's fine, and this is the impact on our application, or this is the impact on the integrations that we have built. If you get sign off from all the vendors, then you can proceed. And that way the business is still continuing to move forward, but you're also managing and controlling that change quite well. I've seen it with another project where we got live and then they're like, all right, now these are all the things we've got to change. So it's a great thing to assess this regularly, have it part of your risks register. I'm really hoping everyone would have a risk register out of this. That change is a risk, but it is also still important for the business. And the users do need to understand where the data flow are going, because it could be that they don't realize that there might be a little task that they're performing, but it could have impact downstream. I know that with the middleware that we support, majority of the errors that we get are data related, and it's usually through accident. It'll be that, oh, well, someone just added a new item to here quickly because no one could find the item that used to be that. Those little things that people do as quick shortcuts to just get around something. So we need to be able to not only find those, but we want people to be aware of their actions beforehand and what the impact of their change may have on the system. Middleware itself. Now, there is one of the members of our team, he's worked with a lot of middleware products, and I love when he says to me, because he creates these documents for me. It's usually the strengths and weaknesses of a particular piece of middleware software that he's worked with recently. And it's a lessons learned for us too, so that when we're talking to customers in the future and we hear what they're trying to achieve from their integration projects, we know, okay, steer clear of that product or very much point them towards that product, because that is really going to enhance these particular functions that they're needing for that. Now, he says that, look, Narelle, the checkbox might be checked on the sales brochure, but it doesn't do it well. And I think that's a really important point. it doesn't do it well. Because it might be that you've selected this product because of all its checkboxes. But then when you start to try and build out your integrations and you realize that it's maybe only fulfilling 75%, then you have to create all these workarounds for the others. We've been involved in a project where the workaround was so insane that we ended up having to write text files for the middleware to go off and call, run that code, and then come back to the middleware again and perform the next feature. There are ways that we can make certain products do things they're not meant to, but really that's not ideal. And we would prefer to recommend a middleware product to you that we know is going to fulfill all of those requirements. Now, when it comes to things like logging, most people go, yep, checkbox does error logging, great. First of all, some people can't read the error logs that come through. And especially if as a customer, you've said, no, we're going to take this on ourselves. We're going to look after the BAU of our middleware. If you don't have someone that can very easily read the errors, and they're not going to be able to fix any problems. As I mentioned previously, majority of the errors that come from middleware are actually data related. So you need to be able to identify which application that the data was coming from and why it hasn't been able to reach the next one. So you've become very much a data troubleshooter sitting in the middle. But at the same time, we can't see successes in a lot of middleware products. So yes, data has gone from point A to point B, but if you ever need to go back and check what happened during that process, most middleware products are not registering it. You can increase things like logging, but you'll find that you then have a massive amount of logs filling up on your server, as opposed to, say, logs hosting in the cloud, which is much, much easier for successes and failures. It's a cheap way to do it. There's a lot of detail and data. And then it's all in one location that you can then do a search and a find through errors and also success logs. It might be that you found that, yeah, that's passed successfully every single time, but it's not actually doing the process that we thought it would. So what are all the records that have been updated with that value? So being able to go back and historically look at successes and failures is very important. Now, no source control. Hard to believe, but there are still applications being built out there with no source control. So when it comes to deploying, it makes it an extremely risky business. So we really try and push people away from any products that still don't have strong source control. They are generally cheaper, but it does cost the business in the long run because it's much harder to isolate problematic code. And just one thing that I think a lot of people don't think about too much until they're live is process failures. Okay, so the process fails, it fails. Okay, so what happens from there? Who's responsible for retrying that event? How do we do that? And so, all the middleware that we recommend is where it can have a retry event. So it might be that it'll sit for 30 seconds and it will try again, say if it's a network timeout or a communication failure. If it's a data issue, then we fix the data and it will process and try the event again. So it just minimizes the amount of manual troubleshooting that you need to do to know that, especially when you're working with both cloud and on-premise products, that is where you do tend to get a lot of timeouts. If you've got, say you've got your middleware sitting in the middle and it's polling a cloud product and then it's writing to an on-premise product, you might have some quite tough firewalls to get through. There might be a delay. Then that event fails, and it hasn't failed because it was bad data or a bad process. It was just purely a communication timeout. But if that was an important piece of information that needed to be pushed through, then you've got to wait for someone to have a look at it, check that everything's okay, and retry the event again. So it really can slow down what you're needing to push through into your systems. So just to say that with middleware, not all middleware is the same. When it comes to things such as the monitoring, I always try and focus in on that. Well, do we need to have alerts and notifications going out to particular people in your organization to let them know that an event has failed and it needs to be pushed through again? Or do we need someone to go and have a look at that data? So it is when we look at your internal staff and who is there to help out, are you going to be looking after your business as usual? That's what part of what we look at is, what is the availability of these people to be able to look into these data issues? Do you have a designated IT group that has the knowledge of your processes and your functions in order to be able to troubleshoot that? And I have to say that anywhere that says, okay, well, everyone that was involved in the middleware team, in the middleware project, even though you're going back to your old jobs, you're now going to have to identify any of the data issues or the failures. It really slows down that troubleshooting process and creates a stall in your business's operations. So we always highly recommend about 2 people that are trained on understanding the full architecture of your integration and your middleware setup, so that they can then push it out to the correct people and assign it to them as part of their daily tasks. So it's important that it gets written into their job description. Otherwise, you can end up with some very disgruntled everyday workers that are finding themselves trying to figure out why certain data hasn't passed through their systems. One of the things that I've noticed probably over the last 10 years is everyone has gone from, yep, we actually want to click to configure system so that we can look after it ourselves. In 10 years, I still don't have a customer that's looking after their own middleware and their integration project. The only customer that has taken on some responsibility for that was because they had a data analyst as part of their team. Now, the reason I say this is like what I spoke about before. Sometimes the everyday people in your organization can get stuck with managing it. And remember what I mentioned about change management? Well, change management is just as important after you go live, because now that it's up and running, you start adding new values to drop down lists just because someone said, oh, that's missing. Can we just quickly add it? It's not a big deal. That could be a problem. So you need someone that's not only managing the product, but change too. Now, do you have the right internal skills, or do you need to hire in? Forcing people into these roles, if they don't really have a passion for it, can be problematic, and you can see people resign just because on top of their everyday workload, they now have an IT part of their job. I do have a customer though, there were 3 people that said, I enjoyed this so much, I now want this to become part of my job. And we actually they rewrote their job descriptions for them. So it enabled them certain hours of the day to be able to work on the change management aspect of their integration project for BAU. And it kept the whole thing just, it kept it vital. So it kept people engaged. It made sure that they just kept moving forwards with change, but it was done properly and it was done well. And organizational change management also came into this too, so that they were informing the people out there through a regular communication channel of the changes that were being implemented and how that would impact their day-to-day lives. And it was great because they were able to take their functional knowledge of the business and understanding of how people work in their business and communicate that out in a non-technical way. So they were getting some more parts automated, and then they could talk to the people that impacted and say, hey guys, from now on, you know how you always have to, every time you enter a new thing, you got to allocate it to here and apply that. We've now written some logic that goes off and looks that up, figures it out by the branch, and goes and inserts that value for you. So there's always that, continual enhanced improvements, and that just really makes people take this on board. Something that a lot of people don't realize is that when you do get integration platform as a service and you have your middleware as a service, by a company like Fusion 5, it's actually faster to build and it's cheaper to maintain. So we on average can code about 1/3 faster if we're the ones that are fully in charge of the project. And that's to do with a lot of the tools we have, the experience, but also we can give you a certain element of pre-configured structure that's there. And then when it comes to the maintenance of it, you've got a designated team. We have specific monitoring that we've created that it's fully visible 24/7. And we can also do things such as we can find data anomalies. So yes, data is passing through perfectly fine as it always has, but there are 300 lesser sales orders that have gone through this month compared to this time last year. Now, if we're talking exactly this month, we know why. You know, with everything that's been going on with COVID, we know that everyone's sales are a little mismatched. But if you're comparing apples for apples when it came to months, we could actually tell you that there may be an issue somewhere in another one of your applications. Maybe your website's down, perhaps your sales order entry, something's gone wrong there, but the volumes are not making sense for this time of year. So while it's not a failure and it's not even a success, we are saying overall, we think your data actually needs some investigating just purely based on volumes. And it can even be things such as, well, all of your tickets usually come through with attachments on them, and we haven't had an attachment in 3 days, and we can notify you of that. And that's all automated. So that's using cognitive services that we're building into software now to detect anomalies in things such as your data. But lastly, you know, selecting an experienced vendor to maintain your integrations just means faster diagnosis too, and clear instruction on resolution. You don't have to worry about, is this a technical issue? Is everything connected? We find that for you. And then the only thing that needs to happen from there is if once we've investigated, we can say, look, there's a new element of data that's come into play here. So that needs to be put into this system over here so that it can successfully pass through. So as far as my top 5 pieces of advice, please make an honest assessment as to whether you can support your integration business as usual. This will impact every decision you make moving forwards. If you're not honest about that up front, you may select the wrong middleware, you may select the wrong teams. Every decision from that point forward will be impacted by that decision. So please be extremely honest with yourselves on that. Look at the final requirements for your middleware. Logging, source control, now transformations. Transformations is where something needs to happen before it moves from or in between A and B. So it may be from A, it is this type of value, but when it goes into B, it needs to be turned into a code. So the transformations, or it could be a string that needs to go into a numeric. It's all of these different data transformations that need to occur as part of an integration project that needs to cater for every one of your business processes, that transformations. Otherwise, you will find yourself doing a lot of workarounds to make it happen. And that's where it can get very painful to manage moving forwards. Timing your integration project. It is so important. I mentioned before how we were trying to build the plane while flying it. Endpoints, and also look at the completeness of your processes. If you're in this massive state of change in your organization, now is not the time to do an integration project. Have it on the radar, definitely, and start putting notes down as to areas of change that may impact an integration project. One of the projects I was involved in, there was 3 years before we actually kicked it off because they did have so much change going in their business. And what we're doing, we're meeting about once every 6 months because at first it was like, yep, we're going ahead, we're getting this done. So we'd create our first, bit of system architecture. I think this is how the data's going to flow. No worries. We get together 6 months later. What's changed? All right, cross out that box, cross out that one. That's no longer happening. This application is now used for something completely different. All right, so what new boxes do we have on the table? Puts the new architecture diagrams up there. So we're meeting every 6 months just to do a check-in until we felt the business was stable enough to move forwards. Went to there. Your solution architect. They are going to be the most critical person in this project, and they cannot just be technically sound. They must be functionally knowledgeable too, because they are partly acting as the go-to person for the functional people. When it comes to hierarchy, there always needs to be an SME at every level, but that solution architect is the one that's going to be bringing it all together and saying this is just possible or not possible with the way that the data needs to transfer between these two systems. We had an example where It was even just a terminology. It was a sell to address. So the word sell to the salesperson was used very different to sell to by their accounts people. And so when the first architecture diagram was put together, someone just went, oh yeah, well, let's just join the sell to addresses together. But then as a solution architect, you look at it and say, well, the sell to used by the salesperson isn't the same as a sell to for the accounts. The sell to is the entity that they are selling to in accounts. The sell to in the CRM was just an address. So we're not even, well, it's the same name fields, they have completely different purposes. One stores a company name, the other one actually stores a physical location. So you need to have someone that is knowledgeable of the system and the functions in order to. And I've mentioned continually about data, and I don't want to sound negative about it, but you must put incredible value on your data alignment and conversion. You tend to find that it's a project happening in the background while you're actually building out your integration, but understanding the differences between the data in both systems, and then how is that going to be transformed before it moves into the next system is so important. And this is where we get the code testing versus code and data. So when you're creating your test plan and you have these different, well, what we were doing was we were doing unit testing, and then we called condition testing for code, where we got all the vendors. So we do our bit, and then we get all the vendors together, and we would test that process, just that one part of the process of that integration project, with controlled data that we had been told will be there, and that is, and then we can prove that the code was working. And then once we had proved that all of our checkpoints worked with controlled data, we then started introducing live data. And then we got a real idea of what needed to be changed around data. So, and this is why I keep saying you tend to find that majority of the errors are data, especially when you're working with BOMs and items, and those very small items, but large quantities. That's where you tend to find that you can get just part numbers that are slightly different in one system to another. And just lastly, I'm going to give you one bonus bullet point. Please use people that are experienced in integration projects. There is such a learning curve. And I think any of us that are in IT knows that, as I said at the start, people look at it in a simplistic way. I just want all data to flow seamlessly from point A to point B. We'll be fine. Now get on with it. Make that happen. But if you use people that are experienced, like I said, before you walk into that hole, we can just slightly push you to the side and say, all right, we know how to avoid this. So how can we help? We do assist a lot with middleware assessments and recommendations. So we start to look at those checkboxes in more details that are on the sales brochure, and then we compare it against what you're actually needing to get out of your integration project. It is very rare these days that there is an integration project without middleware. There's just too many transformations. It might be that I know that for one of our projects, we have a single line of XML code that turns into about 25 different functions in another application. It's incredible what you can do. But understanding where some middleware products bottom out is really, really important. We do gap and risk assessments. We can find out, yep, planned really well for this area, not so much in here. Always say have a risks register, any good project will. And we can start to identify possible areas of risk based on previous experience too. We like to help out people with templates for tracking and monitoring of the key elements. It just means that it's like anything, whenever you've got a checklist, it stays front of mind. And we just make sure that you're planning and continually checking up on those elements so that we know that it's not just the coding that's on the right path, that it's everything else that is as well. We do assist with solution architecture. It's a bit of for someone that's never done it before, it can be hard to take in all the different components that make up different applications. We do have specialist solution architects, They work with large applications and have a lot of experience in integration projects. It's really good even just to pick their mind on some things. You can have an internal solution architect, no problem, but just have a chat to someone that's been there, done that, and I'm happy to help you out there. And just lastly, process assessments. When it comes to, when I said mature processes, we can look at it and say, well, yes, it's a mature process. You've been using it for 20 years, but currently your process looks like it's built around an old piece of software. And it's not actually what your business wants to do. So let's look at where we can streamline this, where you can start to cut back the number of complexities, and that simplifies the integration for you too. So that's it from me at the moment. And I'll just have a quick look. We haven't had any questions come through, but if you would like to ask any, please feel free to put it in the question section. I'm also extremely happy to just have some one-on-one calls with you guys if you need any assistance at all, just with general middleware integration. I enjoy, this might sound a little crazy, but I actually really enjoy the projects. I know they're complicated and I know they can be challenging, but when you get these systems to just flow through, you've got a nice change management process set up at the end of it, you're actually really helping a lot of people in your business. And that's probably why I enjoy it so much, because at the end of it, once it goes live and you can see that people aren't having to double and triple enter things, it reduces that human error element, but knowing that it's working for everyone and we don't need to worry about a customer ringing up and saying, hey, I'm sure I approved, all of this on my particular product, but this is all that's come through. It's a single point of information that then flows through all of your systems. So is there any questions at all? No, we've got 10 minutes to spare. So what I'll do is I'll go on mute, but if anyone would like to hang around and ask a question, I'm happy to chat to you one-on-one. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. It is difficult to wrap up such a complex subject into bullet points, I will say. So that is why we do enjoy the one-on-ones where we can do a lot of back and forth with you and have a discussion about what have you already thought about, what have you planned, what are you concerned about, and we could just give you a landscape as far as how other people have also attempted similar projects, or whether if you're wondering if your business is in a position to take on a project such as integration or middleware at the moment, we can help you with that too. But if you need to leave right now, I just want to say thank you and hopefully I'll speak to you soon. Thanks.